Welcome to Breaking Banks.
Fintech, you may have noticed, is kind of hot. It seems every day a new king or queen of the unicorn mountain is being crowned. What's the future of fintech? Matt Harris wrote in Forbes last year that fintech is the fourth platform, joining internet for connectivity, cloud for intelligence, and mobile for ubiquity as the pillars upon which modern software is being built. Earlier this year, Angela Strange of A16Z wrote a great piece that in the future, every company will be fintech. Does that mean all other kinds of software and startups are going away? No. Something we talk about quite a bit on the show is the idea that in the future, finance will be embedded, not a standalone thing. How is that possible? Wade Arnold, founder of Banno that was acquired by Jack Henry, and his latest startup, Moov, might have the answer. Open source. Wait, did I just say open source? Banks and fintechs may talk about opening digital accounts, open banking, and open APIs, but open source? Could there be something more antithetical to financial service software than open source? In the first half, Maria Palma, principal at RRE Ventures, joins Wade and I to talk about open source in a future where fintech is everywhere. You just don't see it. Now, quick disclosure, Maria and I, along with Matt Harris from Bain, are investors in Moov. Another quick disclosure, Maria is out on maternity leave, but was kind enough to make time to record this segment. And between her son and my daughter, well, they had their own fintech chatter going on. Wade also managed to find a hotel with the world's worst internet connection. In the second segment, Chloé James hosts the next installment of Females in Focus for Fintech. This week, she is Adrienne Harris, frequent contributor, investor, advisor, and former policymaker, as well as Bianca Lopes, founder and identity strategist at Talle. Banking as a service gets thrown around as a phrase, and I found myself in many conversations where, like, partway through, I'm like, wait, are we talking about the same thing? And I can only imagine, Maria, that as venture capitalists, you get pitches all the time. What are the different flavors of banking as a service, or is it only me that I sometimes find that phrase gets thrown around, but it's kind of like a blanket term of like, kind of like a bank, but not really a bank, and it's the quasi-bank world?
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. It gets thrown around for many different things, from banks that have technology offerings to API products to compliance offerings. It really gets used for anything, I think, that is technology enabling some sort of financial services. So it's probably good to define it, even though I'm sure everyone would define it differently. When we think about banking as a service, or when I think about it from the RRE lens, we really think about enabling some sort of financial offering, more like embedded finance for a bank or a non-bank, right? Any technology company. But as opposed to building something yourself, you're using it as a service in the sense that you're building on somebody else's technology and almost paying as a per transaction or per use type of basis, as opposed to building something yourself and owning the technology stack. It's more about kind of where the stack sits and what you're leveraging in-house versus externally. And that's why I think of it as a service.
So it's the stack portion of it, not the bank license portion of it. You know, you have...
Yes. That's what I think about it. Because also the bank license, you can really play it any different way, right? So you can have a banking as a service provider that has their own license that you can leverage, or you as the customer, bank, technology company, whatever you want, can use your own sponsor bank or partner bank. And there's kind of any flavor of that. And I think that's something that Moov, one of the reasons why Moov's offering is so interesting is you can leverage any different bank, whereas a lot of players just have a kind of subset of ODFIs that you can partner with. But I do think it makes it more complex to think about the regulatory landscape, and that's why the term gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah. So Wade, when you and I first met, we talked about this idea of developer-led approach to banking as a service. What would you add to Maria's definition?
For me, from a developer-led, most software engineers have no clue the regulatory burdens, risk and compliance, BSA, AML, all the pieces that go behind just offering a balance and transactional history and providing that service to their end users. And so I think, being able to package up these banking products, but allowing them to be embedded into different product offerings without the developer having to be a banker and go to the graduate school of banking is really that high bar that's necessary for that to happen. If we look at in the e-commerce world, in merchant checkout, Stripe's done a great job of you not needing to know everything about what it takes to underwrite and accept a credit card and allowing developers to integrate that into their product. When we look at retail and commercial banking, similar offerings need to happen.
So, I mean, that speaks, I think, just the tip of the iceberg when you were bringing the band back together from the Bano team to found Moov. What was the market opportunity you saw? Was it a Stripe-like opportunity? Did you stop and say, hey, that's it? Or did it start with something, your founding story, something more tactical?
The founding story of Moov was there's these low-level protocols in financial services that have been around forever, and they aren't going anywhere. So something like ACH moving $55 trillion worth of money a year was invented in the 1970s in punch cards with store and forward technology. But even though new rails may come, that's not going away. Even though new innovation may happen around credit reporting, the Metro 2 format's not going away. IRS fire system and doing reporting of 1099s isn't going away. And so these low-level protocols, are something that I think most developers have thought, that's too hard for me to figure out on my own. And really the impetus of Moov and being this inclusive open source community is allowing developers to come in, learn how these protocols actually work, and plug into it and build great things.
What I think is really interesting, Wade, about the developer-led approach, as you mentioned, is not only the technology aspect, but also the sales aspect of how do these companies actually integrate banking as a service, right? So if you have to go through an entire enterprise negotiation and sales process, it's much trickier to evaluate the options and to actually leverage technology. So I think one of the things about developer-first approaches is they allow you to test right away, which is key to the sales process. And they allow you to leverage to provide better products for your consumer. So I think that's one thing that's another important part about developer-led. I think as we look back historically, it used to be that everyone was going after the CIO to sell them the technology. And then everyone was going after the CMO, right? And I think that we're starting to see developers actually just make decisions themselves and empower themselves. And as you said, Wade, it's not this, very pretty packaged together thing. It's a holistic, you have regulatory, you have the bank side, you have the technology side. And so every developer that has tried to do ACH has gotten the same 400-page manual to create an ACH offering, right? I think you and I talked about this in one of our first meetings, and it's, okay, how do you go from that? And especially if you're a technology company and not a fintech, you maybe don't have fintech developers, how do you take away that pain for them? And it's not even just creating the manual, but it's what happens if you get the timing wrong and all of a sudden your transactions don't go through to the Fed. I mean, those things matter, and it's really underneath the surface, those great details make a huge difference. And that's why the open source element of this and developers being able to help contribute has been a huge aspect in getting the right product.
Well, you're using the phrase open source, and I can just imagine CISOs at every major bank, thinking about that for a second, and their heads beginning to explode, and the red phone getting picked up and talking to compliance. The entire business of RSI and Black Duck and Veracode has been around. How do you make sure there is an open source? And now we're saying, hey, wait a second, part of what financial services needs is more open source. Wade, how do you combat that misnomer?
So the reality is that every financial institution and every company is already utilizing open source. So whether that's a database, a programming language, operating system, a messaging queue, those systems are already embedded. Heck, they probably have 1,000 different open source JavaScript libraries that are being used on their website today in order to provide a compelling offering. So the question really comes back to what's the governance behind open source? And I think that's what Moov's doing well, right? We've allowed kind of the community to be a part of it, but we add in the governance around it to ensure that rogue code can't be added into it. And what I would personally rather err on is millions of people looking at source code rather than 5 people at a big provider that aren't writing test cases, aren't documenting their code. You don't get away with those things in public view of a bigger community. And so banks are already doing this. It's just a question of what level of the technology stack are they ready to adopt in order to innovate and go faster.
One of the things that excited me most when we started the conversation was this idea, this might be counterintuitive, but that it is the lower level of the stack and that it is open source. Because I don't think a lot of those who are driving innovation, whether it's at the startup level, the finance level, for the VC coming into the fintech, and especially the bank, really understand how expensive those low-level protocols and functions are when taken in the aggregate, right? That like those are really expensive pieces to go out and build.
Yeah, to your point on the low-level protocols, I think not everyone realizes how expensive it is to build them correctly, and also how hard it is to innovate there. Pretty much everyone that has a better stack on top of it is still plugging into the same low-level protocols that have always been there, and that's where we really need to innovate. That's also one thing that I think is really interesting about Moov's approach is that there were a few different, as we said, banking as a service before. A lot of the traditional banking as a service players that I've seen in market have been in the middleware side. So they connect you to the old level protocols, and they connect you to whatever kind of new consumer experience you're connecting to. However, what is interesting about the fintech world is that most of your money is made on transaction fees. And so over time, you want to have the most flexibility of product, but you also want to have the most share of economics. So to do that, you actually need to be able to control lower level. And a middleware player over time, I think, would just get used as a launching pad. And then over time, people would build their own to have more of the economics. But someone like a Moov that actually builds into the lower level protocols is a very interesting value proposition.
And I think open source also allows a greater surface area of use cases, right? So, I'm driving this open source project and I have a very specific payment related use case for what I want to accomplish with it. But then the open source world shows up and you have top 2 bank in the United States use our libraries to run years of transactions in order to train their machine learning models. So now all of a sudden, the same little project that was supposed to allow for payouts gets used for fraud detection and machine learning. Large companies really grabbing it, and by using it in different use cases really allows for the product and the project to be more mature.
Wade, can you give us a sense of how many transactions that really is without talking about the bank? If it's a few years worth, how many transactions is that that's going through the libraries?
Yeah, so we had one use case that's top 2 bank, $4.2 trillion worth of transactions through the library. And then they knew those transactions actually cleared from the Federal Reserve before. So when there was any edge cases, they were able to update the library. So now anybody else who uses the library gets the benefit. And very recently, we had one of the nation's largest fraud products started utilizing the library. And so now they're looking at transactions on behalf of hundreds of financial institutions. The incredible piece is watching trillions of transactions go through the library, and those are being fed into machine learning models for fraud and data analytics. And it allows those low-level protocols to have all of these edge cases, all this surface area that very quickly you take a library that I contributed to 18 months ago, now being the de facto standard for how to process that file, year and a half later.
And while you talk about the fact that it gives you that level of surface area, I think one of the things that really appealed to me was the fractionalization aspect of it as well. So Angela Strange at A16Z wrote a great piece for their newsletter recently based on her talk from their summit back in November of 2019 about eventually everything will be fintech. And at its surface, love Angela, love debating with her, but at first it was like, not everything is going to be fintech. Maybe you could say, well, anything that's going to make money involves commerce. But when I think about, where this idea of open source fits in, where there is almost always some role within fintech or something related to your financial life besides commerce that can fit in, but you don't want to have to build the whole thing, right? Like it's, when we hear, oh, we're going to be the neobank that is like the bank of, pick your brand, Virgin Mobile tried it and went away from it, but it was like, hey, let's go replicate everything that is a bank and just brand it, Virgin, or some of these other approaches, versus the idea of, if there are specific financial elements that I can just pick up from within a Moov that I can bed into a larger product and service without having to be that, the full-fledged bank or go fully build something, that actually becomes a very rich, almost invisible banking approach to the world.
I think what's driving that, though, is anybody who's ever used Airbnb or anybody who has ever used an Uber can recognize that that payment experience is better, right?
Yes.
So is that a per fee transaction model? No. They're not trying to make revenue off of that. They're trying to keep the consumer in this great marketplace application. And I think that is what's going to make everything a fintech, in the same way that, in 2000, everything needed a web page, and lots of businesses said, our customers know us in our branch, right? And
they'd rather come into the branch and see us and get a cup of coffee and a cookie.
2010, everything's going to be mobile. Not my customers. They're going to want to, use my antiquated online banking in their computer room and never use their mobile app. And if the trend repeats itself, 2020 is really, how can those payments, how can that stored value extend into these marketplaces that many consumers actually trust a lot more than the institution? Yet that still is the financial institution behind it.
Yeah, I think this is a massive point, Wade. So, one of the things we think a lot about as we think about our investing thesis at RRE is the biggest thing that has changed in financial services in the last kind of 2 decades has been the brand permission, meaning who you actually let touch your finances, right? Technology has been changing, other things have been changing, but this is the first time where you let other technology companies move your money because you trust them for something else. And so I think what Wade mentioned there is really, really important, because this type of platform can be leveraged by so many different players, right? The Uber example is a good one for how any technology can have an embedded finance component. Mindbody, Toast, you look at some of these companies that aren't financial services company, and a massive portion of their revenue is coming from financial services. And so now you have technology companies who can use this, big and small, right? You have startups that leverage this on a daily basis because it's easy to use. Then you have large banks who can use it for new offerings especially. And you also have 6,000 community banks in the US that need to come up with better digital products. And so as you look across the spectrum, there's so many different ways to leverage this, not just for banks per se.
Well, let's talk about the community banks for a second, Wade, because I can see the biggest banks, they're great, digesters of technologies, and the fintechs also, they're built on, leveraging these stacks. It's their most competitive advantage is just actually being agile in that way. For the mass part of the market within the incumbent financial services, how do you see them beginning to leverage open source?
So what we're seeing is either consolidation. So they've got 5 different ACH platforms that do peer-to-peer payments or account-to-account transfers or payroll services. All of them have their own data warehouse, their own fraud detection, their own data lake behind it, right? And so how can they combine these efforts so that they can decrease their operating costs? That's one model we keep on seeing repeated in that billion to $100 billion marketplace. The other place that is probably more exciting, I'd call it the Marcus knockoff, right? I'm going to keep on running my branch banking, and that's where all my deposits are at. That's where all my loans are at. But I'm not going to wait until somebody supplants me in this digital first economy. And so now they're standing up this side core in order to go after an unserved marketplace, be very strategic and pointed with that offering. And so that's happening as well. And, I don't see any bank ripping and replacing their core anytime soon, as long as there's people still driving up to the drive up. But we see people, placing bets and trying new innovation.
I often talk about the shadow core as a strategy. You've just given me a new one. People need a side core, not just a side hustle. You need a side core that you operate with.
New word invented here. Side core.
New word. Jason's new soapboxes. You need a side core. And I think that's an important element, not just for the incumbent financial institutions, but there's a lot of the incumbent other deliverers of service that in order to remain relevant are going to need to find ways to tuck in, because almost always the startups that are coming to disaggregate not just financial services, but other parts of brands, whether it be, the Airbnbs that Maria's in or the Ubers that, Wade took to get to the hotel, But there's these other pieces that are now being attached digitally that need the equivalent of the, how do I become the, Spotify, or not Spotify, that it meant the Shopify for, becoming actual tech enabled in finance or fintech enabled in what they serve.
Yeah, I think to your point around the Shopify example, there's an embedded finance piece. But as we think about the use cases for different banks, what I also think is interesting is even just to offer small product changes, you also need these side core examples. So, when Chime lets you get your direct deposit a day early, they have to find a product way to do that. And now all the other banks are responding and doing the same thing. And if they just have their old low-level protocols, it's harder for them to do that, right? So as they want to compete with potential challenger banks or even just other technology companies, they're going to need side cores and they're going to need better technology.
We're working with a $120 billion in asset institution that has a really interesting plus or minus 10 billion. Now you can narrow it down to 4. The really interesting go-to-market strategy, but they're actually trying to be agile. They're trying to iterate. They're trying to prove out the business model first. And to me, what was fascinating about this discussion is, they're currently running Hogan for their internal core. So they thought it was going to cost more to actually integrate to their existing operations than to use a third party in order to investigate whether or not this was a good idea. So a $110 billion bank, they're putting deposits at a different bank just to investigate an idea and iterate and try and go to market. And if they prove it out, then they're going to spend all the money to bring it back in-house. I mean, talk about a reason that a bank can't innovate. They're putting deposits with somebody else just to try something new. And that's why I think the market is going to start changing towards how can I get product to market faster at a lower cost so that I can try new experiments.
Well, I would actually applaud that bank for having the courage to go do that, because too many would actually get hung up on, oh, it's going to cost us this much to go do it. And so instead of taking a test and learn approach, they're going to actually overplan and then kind of keep dumbing down the idea until it becomes something they're actually willing to invest all of that money in. And so at the end of the day, they do one of two things, which is they've dumbed it down and overbuilt it only to find out it doesn't work. And then they continue doing it because we already invested all of this money in it, right? And so we must follow the waterfall that is, been launched. This idea, again, back to how do we de-risk taking risk, I think is one of the important things that, as much as there is a latent fear of open source, I liked your description of well-vetted open source is actually a lot less risky than building something yourself.
And no question about it. And, all of the cloud providers are built on what? Open source, right? Yeah. We've got Linux, we've got Kubernetes, we've got Postgres, MySQL, all of these tools. The web server, we used to have to buy a web server 20 years ago. We used to buy an application server from IBM. So all these pieces of the stack are just being commoditized, which they should be in financial services, and they just need to work. And so I think we just see history repeating itself as pieces that used to be on a proprietary mainframe are now becoming open source and in the cloud.
Yeah, I think this goes to kind of the latest trend we're seeing, which is around this cloud innovation hitting the fintech stack, right? I think if we think about the waves of innovation at fintech, and RRE has been investing in fintech for 24 years, there was sort of the analog to digital shift, and then there was internet and mobile banking changing the way the fintech was done. And then we've seen sort of this unbundling of the bank for a solid decade, where people were kind of just taking pieces of, you went to the Wells Fargo website, there was a famous CB Insights picture, which most people remember, where they showed each startup that was tackling each point solution. But then over time, you want more share of wallet and you want more of a consistent relationship with the customer. And so each kind of point solution then started offering more things, right? So, SoFi was no longer just student loans, Robinhood was no longer just investing, et cetera, et cetera. And I think now that we're in this rebundling moment, the biggest shift we're seeing is really cloud finally impacting the fintech wave. And it makes sense that it was impacted later, given the regulatory complexities in this space. But I think we're finally seeing that innovation happening, which is great. And the other thing I would add is we're finally seeing, at least from the investment standpoint, the teams tackling this that we want to see tackling this, right? There's plenty of times where I would back a really smart 21-year-old to go fund an amazing company. And there's plenty of those success stories. Building financial infrastructure is not one of them, right? You want teams who actually know how to build here, and Wade and his team have built into 42 different cores. But as you think about what makes this product successful, you need people that understand the nitty-gritty system today and the lower level protocols, to your point, Jason.
So you're saying you would not have invested in Moov if Wade did not have all of that gray hair in his mountain man beard.
And also not the beard, exactly. That was key to the story.
Clearly a technologist. He has a beard and glasses.
Yeah, you gotta have the technology and the beard. But I also think it's what makes me very optimistic about the future of fintech, because, I think incumbents do have advantages in terms of cost of capital and distribution, but I think the most phenomenal talent in the space and all the devs that we know, first of all, love Moov, but also they want to be working at technology companies that they think are really changing the face of financial services for the future. They don't want to go take an offer at a large bank. And if you talk to, I actually, work with large banks, have a lot of respect for them, and there's things that they do well. But I think that in the talent game, a lot of great talent wants to go work on really interesting infrastructure in the space.
So Wade, last question. When it comes to talent, those that are joining the open source movement related to this, I'm curious the trends you're seeing about the people who are not just getting excited about it, but who's contributing versus pulling out, code into, the GitHub that Moov has been developing.
It's crazy the range of people, payment companies that are publicly traded, to financial institutions, big and small, to broker dealers that are doing payouts of loan closings, to like trucker fleet management companies. If there's one consistent theme, it's that I'm surprised at the amount of people that are touching money, and how many people can't find a turnkey solution. So then they go to GitHub because screw it, I'm just going to build it myself. And the first place you go is GitHub. And then they join the community. And the majority of people that are contributing source code back, they don't even know what fintech is. They're just trying to solve a problem. And that seems to be the consistent theme. It's not just startups, it's not just big banks, it's not just financial service providers. It's everybody who's trying to build something new is who runs into our community.
So in that sense, I think, Angela was correct that everything is becoming fintech.
I think Angela's pretty smart. Give her some kudos.
I agree with her as well. I think, everyone's becoming a banker of fintech in some way.
So, thanks for opening up about the future of open source and where it takes the fintech world.
Hello and welcome to Women in Fintech, a Breaking Banks initiative bringing females into focus in fintech. I'm your host, Chloé James. Just days ago, the world lost an amazing woman, a pioneer and a true legend. Ruth Bader Ginsburg spent a lifetime flourishing in the face of adversity before being appointed a Supreme Court Justice, where she successfully fought for women's rights, against gender discrimination, and unified the liberal bloc of the court. So many have been impacted by her life and now her death, and we dedicate this episode of Women in Fintech to her memory. All she stood for, fought for, challenged, changed, and achieved. Look, it's no secret that financial services, technology, and the two of those combined are industries dominated by men. At Breaking Banks, we launched this spin-off to look into why that is and what we can do about it. We're here to talk about the big topics affecting our industry, the latest and greatest in fintech, which we love, impacts of the current economic and social landscape on businesses and customers, and what it means to be a woman working in our field. Some of the prickly topics, challenging scenarios, and advice from leaders in the space. Joining me today are two very unique guests who I'm really excited to welcome. Adrienne Harris is a financial services expert, executive, investor advisor, and former policymaker. From Wall Street to the White House to Silicon Valley, her broad perspective makes her uniquely qualified to talk about the future of financial services and how to make the industry work for institutions, markets, and most importantly, consumers. As a people-focused technology leader, Bianca Lopes is fascinated by the intersection of humans and technology. Holding multiple roles over the years, she has leveraged her background and experience in finance and economics to drive her ambitions as a serial entrepreneur. As both a partner and consultant, she has supported over 40 financial institutions and 8 governments in reshaping their human approach to technology, rethinking the role of digital identity, and supporting their innovation agendas. Bianca's goal is to help more business leaders, governments, and consumers understand the impacts of data, digital identity, and cybersecurity. So 2 amazing women joining me today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Well, there was my lead. Yeah, fantastic. There was my lead in. And I'm just really, really excited to welcome you both. We've got 25 minutes. We've got a lot to get through. I just wanted to kick off, as I always do with my guests, as to why the both of you felt this kind of pull and affinity to fintech. Sort of when and why? When did it all begin? And a little bit of the background that sort of got you into this space. Bianca, did you want to kick off?
Sure, why not? Kind of fell backwards into it, Chloe. Studied economics, had a career as an entrepreneur, and then sort of went back to the bank in between a broken venture, actually, and spent about 3 years at RBC, which were a lovely 3 years in Canada, and kind of got interested and carried to the dark side of technology. And fintech wasn't a thing, and I kind of just always looked at coming and having the advantage of being a millennial. I kind of looked at SaaS as the only way to go, and is all I've ever knew. So it was always interesting to me when people started talking about financial technology and fintechs as if they were coming to change the world. And I have to say, like, I'm a big advocate for innovation and creativity. I don't know if I've seen fintech live up to its promise of really changing banking, though. So I'll leave that and leave Adrienne to introduce herself.
Well, I would say, similarly, in some ways fell backwards into it. My whole career has been in financial services, first as a Wall Street lawyer, working with all the big institutions, all the big names that people know, and then into policymaking, first at the Treasury Department, and then as a special assistant to President Obama in the White House, where I managed the financial services and housing finance portfolios. And it was really there, I was thinking about my industry experience, I was thinking about policymaking, and we were doing so much on financial reform after the financial crisis and implementing Dodd-Frank, and all of those reforms were so important to get done for consumers, for markets. But I found myself thinking like, wow, we're doing all this sort of backward looking work. Again, all of which was necessary and important, but we should also be thinking about the future of financial services. And for me, I've always loved financial services just because it really is the foundation of the economy. I tell my friends, I'm like, try and pick another area of the economy that works without financial services somewhere in the background. And so it became really important for me to start thinking about the future of financial services, not just as its own vertical, but as the foundation of our economy. And that really led me to fintech. And so really started thinking about policy making with respect to fintech. And then when the administration was over, going out and building my own fintech company with a group of guys, and now doing investing in the space. And I would agree with Bianca. I think there's still lots more of the potential that the industry can live up to, but it's such an important space for me. And I, as I said, spent my whole career in it and love it.
Yeah, makes me want to break into song "Money Makes the World Go Round." I mean, it's such an important cornerstone. There's so much you touched on there, Adrienne. Something that I think was interesting that you raised the GFC and how you dealt with that with the Obama administration. Given what's going on at the moment, so now we're going through COVID and we're going through this huge global pandemic, which is having such an impact on financial services. How does it, this is a bit of maybe a curly question, but how does it differ from what you're seeing now as to what happened in sort of 2008 as far as a huge sort of shake-up to financial services?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting comparison. I mean, now the industry has been shored up, so the issues we saw in 2008 we're not seeing now with respect to the stability of the system because of the lessons we learned in 2008, right? Because the banks are much better capitalized, because the regulators have better tools to respond, as we've seen with central banks around the world, right? They've been able to respond much more quickly to try and prevent economic shocks, the likes of which we saw in 2008. But like in 2008, we're seeing people at the bottom of the income spectrum and at the wealth spectrum being hit hardest. Like 2008, this crisis is highlighting the inequities we see in our society. And unfortunately, we often have such short memories. So for those of us who aren't affected day to day, or who are not sort of at the lower end of the income spectrum, the lower end of the wealth spectrum, we have this tendency to forget how disproportionately impacted these folks are. And yet again, we find ourselves in a crisis highlighting all these inequities. And I think, we've done a better job preventing systemic collapse this time, but we still have a lot of work to do in terms of protecting those that are least well off among us.
Absolutely. And I know that consumers are such a huge passion of yours, and, reading up about you prior to this, that's such a huge piece of what you do. It's really interesting to raise the inequities. Brett King, who obviously is, my biggest support of this spin-off of Breaking Banks, he speaks very much to that point. So you've possibly had that conversation with him also. He absolutely agrees. Bianca, you're doing a bit of traveling at the moment, which is amazing. I'm kind of jealous. I know that you're...
I'm on COVID test number 9.
Yeah, you are. You're
positive.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about what you're seeing around the world then. I know that, I follow you on social media and follow all of your incredible work. What are you seeing as some of the biggest impacts, and challenges since March, and obviously since sort of COVID-19 kicked off? Yeah, just on your travels, what are you seeing?
I've been fortunate enough to travel in a time, I don't know if it's fortunate or misfortunate, but I see most things as an opportunity. And I've seen a bit of chaos, to be honest. For those of you who might know, I'm from Brazil originally, and I've gone to Brazil twice during the pandemic. So it was quite heartbreaking to see some of the tangible impacts showing up on the streets, but not only on the mentality and the mental health of people, and the very little that people are talking about as leaders. I've been seeing some banks, I work with a lot of banks, some banks cut their innovation budgets and put all their projects on hold. So I think that from a professional perspective, that has a massive impact. And I think it couldn't be furthest from what they should probably be doing. Because if they were behind before, they're just about to be behind more now. And the second one that worries me the most is I've seen some communication projects and communicating in times of change and at times of psychological unsafety couldn't be more important. Couldn't be furthest from the truth. What you have to do as a leader to build these safe spaces, and I'm seeing people still not talking about it. I've outspoken about my hate for, not hate's a strong word, but potentially my dislike to the new normal. So when I look around the world, there's nothing normal. There's nothing normal about the time we're living in right now. And I think there is a necessity of still talking about boundaries when work has sort of marched into your personal life and has blended in even more than just being digital and our phones not being off. Now it's in your home for a lot of people. And that means, as Adrienne brought it up, to the less fortunate, that's a problem. Some people are not in Rome. Some people are not in their nice cottage. Some people are piled up with a lot of people in a tiny apartment. High density areas that I visited throughout this pandemic, like some big cities in Brazil, or even just Toronto. I know you're there, Chloé. But seeing Toronto and seeing Trinity Bellwoods, which is a park, beautiful park in Queen Street, turn into tent city, there's nothing normal about this. And I think us in the business community and in financial services, as Adrienne said, it touches everything. It does make the world go around. And maybe that's our jingle for this episode. Yeah. But I think it also has a conscious. So I am, on the positive note, seeing and partaking in some amazing conversations. I've just come back from Germany and Frankfurt, and seeing an ecosystem really devoted to helping each other and talking to each other, which I think it's a little bit more of these real conversations we need to have. So I'm excited that this version of Breaking Banks is happening.
Yeah, thank you. I love that you've raised communication as an issue, because actually, even financial services aside, communication just generally is such a huge topic. I work in communications and have done for many, many years, and just the importance of it is so relevant when you talk about mental health and, people feeling at least secure and safe. Like, you have to just have some kind of information. I was talking to a friend recently here about basically schools going back. We're kind of diverging, but it was all about, schools going back and there just being really no information to parents about sort of how things were all happening. And I mean, that then swings into, you're talking about, let's bring it back to financial services and how staff within an organisation are coping with all this change, not to mention the consumers that it's being passed on to. Communication is such a big piece, and I guess the people that get that right will certainly rise above, and just the importance of that on mental health. Any great examples of success? Adrienne, I'll come back to you. I know Bianca's really highlighted some challenges that she's seen, and you've talked about inequality, but any examples of success under these pressured times that you're seeing kind of in the fintech space, in financial services?
Yeah, I think there's a number of companies, particularly those that are B2C working in the financial health space. We think about those companies that are in the early access to earned wages space. Those that are in the overdraft protection space, right, who have really found a way, despite the fact that they're not yet profitable, despite the fact that there were questions about whether venture funding was going to dry up. They've seen increased demand and lots of growth in their companies, which is great. But of course, they were still often in early stages where they were testing the business model. And I think many of them have found a way to step up and service a bunch of new customers in addition to their existing customers and help make their financial lives a bit easier. So I said it before, but I'll say it again. I agree with Bianca that there's still a long way to go for fintech, especially as we think about financial inclusion and financial health. But I have seen lots of companies, when it could have been easy to pull back or shut down or furlough employees or just say that they couldn't meet the demand, really work with their investors and with their executive teams to figure out how they could service customers in the time when they needed them most.
Absolutely. Bianca, you spoke a little bit before about the new normal, and I can't say it's a phrase that I love either. Also the word unprecedented. I mean, how many times have we heard that word? My husband and I were laughing the other day in the car as we were driving because
I'm glad I'm not alone.
The guy on the radio goes, unprecedented times. And my husband was like, oh my God, how many times do I have to hear that bloody word?
Like listening to scientists.
I know.
It made me laugh though. So I do want to talk a little bit. We're going to go into the women piece in a minute, but I just want to talk a little bit about your predictions for the sort of, for the future. I was wondering, will things ever go back to the way they were? And I'm talking about fintech, finance, business, travel, our lives. Like, do you feel like we will get to a stage where, we can hop on a plane again, we can go and walk and sit in a restaurant without a mask on, we can, walk into the bank and not worry about touching the counter, or, do you think that things are going to return? Is it the case of finding a vaccine? Like, what are your predictions for the future?
I wish I could I had a crystal ball, but I'll give you sort of my indications of some of the things that I'm really interested in the spaces and where I think they might be going. I've been looking a ton of history. I've always been a bit of a history bookworm and sort of looking at the sentiment of how people have passed through industrial revolutions. And I think when you compare on a digitalization scale, some of the enterprises, companies, and governments have been forced to doing something about the PowerPoint that they paid millions of dollars to a consulting firm to get at some point about being digital. And they're having to do it in such a fast pace that it's arising sort of like a bunch of other issues that concern me. I don't think we're going to go back to thinking about digital experiences the same way we thought about before, because we've had to experience them through a state of psychological unsafety, of us through lenses of distress sometimes, or through the lenses of not having infrastructure. So a lot of countries and places have realized that they can't be the same, because if their business model depends on being able to digitally serve their client, they need some sort of better, I wouldn't even say 5G. How about we start with some G that works in some places of the world that don't even have that, right? So I think when I look in the future, I think you're going to see smart companies move into that space and new business models being built as well around this, around servicing digital solutions that is just stuff that you should have been taking for granted, that a lot of innovation people talks about for a long time are going to be just a norm. I think the other thing that the pandemic time has brought me that I hope we don't go back to whatever normal or the previous state was, is this lack of having the tough conversations. I think a lot of conversations around data and ethics, everybody that knows me knows I'm a bit of a fanatic around this topic, is they're overdue, if you ask me. They're some of them are being driven by geopolitical monopoly happening, and they're playing a game between monopoly and war that I don't really know what's going on. But I think we need to stop. I hope the future does not look like this lack of consciousness, of conversation around what consent is, what is happening to data, where does data reside, who is doing what with it, for what purpose. I think that is commodity that humanity is building the fastest. It's the fastest asset class growing in human history. So that's not something to be undermined. And I hope that this state of crisis or elevated stage just showed cracks in an infrastructure that already existed. When people ask me, like, do you think that this is going to make the future, we finally have an identity problem? I think my answer is go look at the news. They can't afford to continue to go this way. There's just they just cannot afford, the financial services sector cannot afford to have this number of fraud. Like the government, public sector can't give out relief funds when you have, as an example, Neymar, which is a very known soccer player to most people in the world, has been able to withdraw 3 different rounds of COVID funding. So 3 different people pretended to be Neymar using a simple password and an attribute. So I hope that that's the normal today. And people have been talking about this since Birch was younger than me. So who knows him gets the joke. Like, this topic has not changed. So I really hope on the new normal, we are not talking about the same thing we were talking about 7 years ago, because I won't stay in the industry.
Okay, well, let's have a conversation in 7 years, and I certainly hope that we're absolutely not. I want to move on to the women's piece. Thanks, Bianca. Awesome answer there, and so much to think about. Adrienne, you've worked over many years. You've worked in policy. I spoke about Ruth Bader Ginsburg when I opened the show just then, which I'm sure has had an impact on your life, the recent occurrence of a few days ago. When we think about women in financial services and in our industry, why don't you think they are more? You also mentioned you started a company with a group of guys. Do you ever see that changing? And also, I just wondered whether you had ever faced any gender bias in your own career, and how you dealt with it if you did.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, Chloé. I mean, I think about all the industries that I've worked in, whether, Wall Street, the high ranks of federal government, Silicon Valley, none of those places are really known for their diversity. We talk about women in fintech, and it's so funny. I say to people, if you've got financial services and tech and you put them together, like, what makes you think this was going to be more diverse than these two industries sort of colliding that are known for their lack of diversity? I do think things are getting better. And to the point you made, Chloé, and you made, Bianca, about communication, like, we're talking about these things so much more, even than when I started my career on Wall Street. We talked about diversity then, but the conversations are more real now. They're more animated. So I am hopeful. I mean, we have seen change over the past decades, but I'm hopeful that that pace of change will continue to accelerate and things will get better. I know it's still going to take some time, but I think women are more vocal. There's more men that are out there advocating for equality, not just on a gender basis, but as we think about race in our society as well. So I am hopeful. For myself, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a woman who has not faced gender bias in her career. Like, I want to meet that woman and find out how she did that. I think, we probably all have stories around gender bias or race bias or some other sort of bias that we've experienced in our lives. I think for me, I really think about combating it in 2 ways that I think are the most sort of concrete. And I often think about the women that are more senior than me, the people who came before me, and what my role is in supporting them and helping them shine and doing what I can to make sure that they continue to advance. And then similarly, looking at those women who are junior to me and making sure I'm reaching back and providing opportunities and providing guidance for them so that they can avoid some of the landmines that I've found or pitfalls that I've fallen into. But I think it's, in my mind, that's really what it's about. The discussions are important. Having male allies is certainly important, but making sure that we're all supporting one another, both as we think about 360 in our careers, I think for me has been something that's really been a guiding force and very important for my personal sanity.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. I love that. I love the kind of paying it forward, paying it backwards, making the conversation really broad. It's very vocal. I've been vocal in this space for a number of years. I think we live in such an age of that instant gratification, and that's a part of digitization really. But actually things, I believe, are changing, have changed, hopefully will change even more so going forward, and perhaps with an acceleration, and certainly putting voices to it is the way that that's going to occur. Bianca, in your perspective, I know as well, I was thinking about, I interviewed you for the Women in Leadership piece years ago now in Las Vegas. I don't know if you remember that, but, I do
remember that. I think that was 2016.
Yeah. Oh God, there you go. Well, I do feel things are changing. What's the perspective?
2016 or 2015.
What's the perspective for you then, in women in our industry, and perhaps any challenges you've faced, and advice that you'd provide for other women?
I think I don't want to talk about the challenges, because I think I agree with Adrienne. Let's stay positive. Like, everybody has challenges and horror stories of various degrees. And I think it's great that we're even talking about it. And I think there's a space for that. I think the advice I would give them is an advice that I'm trying to take in myself. I'm not particularly perfect at it, but I'm in this journey of sort of awareness and really developing an understanding of who I am and sort of where are my boundaries and what are my limiting beliefs. How do sometimes life is just crappy and you can't really choose what you experience, but I think you can choose how you react to what you experience, to what happens to you. You can choose how you see that situation. So I wish back in the day that I was running 1,000 miles a minute, which I'm still sort of, but I was worse.
Has that changed?
I was worse. That has changed. I was worse in investment banking days. That was much worse. Just the product of my everything around me, natural empath. But yeah, I would say just your power to choose. Remember, as a human, and not even just as a woman, your power to choose, your power and how you experience what is. How do you accept what is?
You've made me think of a phrase that kind of stuck with me many years ago, but changing the word to for for. So instead of why did this happen to me, why did this happen for me? I don't know. It was something profound I read, and I kind of thought that's actually really impactful.
Super profound.
It's to your point, to really, making things an opportunity. We started off the conversation today with you saying that you like to see challenges in life as opportunities, and that's certainly having that. And I know that you do a lot of work on yourself and in gratitude and mindfulness and the impact that can have on your professional life as well. We're actually out of time. I knew this would happen. I always love these conversations, and I could talk to you both for hours more, and hopefully we have the chance to do that at some stage over a glass of something together, not over the phone, if we're ever allowed to be together again. Thank you both so much for your time.
One day soon.
Yeah, very, very quickly. Just what next for you both? Anything that where we can hear more from you, more about you, any work you're doing, books, blogs, where we can find out more?
Yeah, so I've got some exciting things coming up, not yet ready for the reveal, but I'll be revamping my website, adrienneharris.com. Always posting on LinkedIn and on Twitter as well, so stay tuned.
Thank you. Bianca?
Super. It'd be the same, similar story, actually. And you can follow Talle, which is my media communications company that's trying to democratize access to LATAM financial services and technology education. So thank you for having me again, Chloe, and bringing such awesome energy as always.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we'll check it out. We'll pop everyone's handles in the show notes. And thank you both for joining me for Women in Fintech. Have a great day.
That's it for this week. If you like the show, make sure to give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, or share it with a friend, or share it on social media.
We'll see you again next week with more Breaking Banks.